What would you say is your main motivation in art?
Well, I started painting when I was 8, and I just loved paint. I loved paper and color, and I have painted ever since. I think I'm motivated by the beauty of what I see, and I really think it's beauty is what I makes me want to paint. I love painting faces. I love painting people. I paint a lot of portraits, and it's just been a lifetime pursuit to try to make things look like what I see. And I don't think it's much more complicated than that. It's kind of like breathing. It's something I have to do. I've never really wanted to do anything else, and it's just been a lifetime of finding out what I need to know to do this.
What deep down do you feel you want to express?
What do I want to express? I want to express the beauty of how things look, because things, as a visual person, I think things are beautiful when I look at them. But I also think that behind the image of the surface of how things look is kind of what I would call a more noumenal world. There's the phenomenal world, which is the things, and then there's a world behind it of, I don't know, you would call it spirit or whatever, but there's something else that lives behind things in art. And when you get down to it in your good work, whenever some days you think you might be getting closer to that, you come closer to something that you just feel is, I don't know, it's just something that makes you want to be with it. And, and it's also what I hope when people look at my work, something will come through of that and make people, enrich them in some way in their lives and make them feel that, I don't know, the world is beautiful and life is good.
Who would you say is your main influences in terms of your technique of painting?
Yeah, I love Velázquez and I love Vermeer, and I think then I have to say the biggest influence for many years has been Sargent. There's just something about his faces, his portraits, the beautiful design. What I love about Sargent is that it's not just a portrait, but it's an entire painting, it's a composition. I love his lost and found edges, I love his materials, I love the fact of his, the way he composes. The figure or the portrait in the rectangle is never just stuck in there, it's not just vignetted, but he creates a dynamic composition, oftentimes with 3 different points that sit in the rectangle in some amazingly inventive way, that every time any painting you ever look at his is like, wow, look at that, look at the dynamism of that composition. But he has that, but he also then has the realism, you know, the beauty of the skin tones. He works from life, you know, he's got it all. But Velázquez was also very, very important to me. I remember after I'd gone to art school, we moved to Egypt and I lived there, and I was painting kind of in an art schooly way. And I remember this guy said to me, he said, why don't you just give up that wrinkled up art school stuff and paint like Velázquez? And I started to look at Velázquez and I started to think, you know, that is what I really want to do. I think there was an early portrait of Velázquez in the Museum of Fine Arts, very early, a man, and I used to look at that thing and think, how did he do that? You know, it just. So I'd say those are sort of my real main influences. All the Boston School are the painters I look at to study and try to further what I can do. Right. But I think my real love is probably Sargent.
Now you're kind of in that lineage, aren't you, the Boston School painters?
Yes.
What is that all about?
The Boston School painters went to Paris, or went to Europe, mainly Paris, in the late 1880s. There were a number of painters from Boston. They went there and studied, several of them with Gérôme, some with in some of the other academies. And they studied all the cast drawing, the French academic way of drawing, the shadow line, the halftones created out of a shadow line, all that very academic drawing. But at the same time was this whole revolution going on outside the academies of Monet and the breakdown of natural light. Tubes of paint were invented, people were going outside and painting, and you had this revolution in understanding natural light. So what the Boston School did, what these painters did, was that they put both of those things together. And when they came back to Boston, They had the natural light, but unlike Monet or any of the Impressionists that broke the form down, they kept this highly academic form and put it together with the natural light. If you look at Joseph de Camp's portrait of his daughter Sally, it's in the Worcester Art Museum, you just see this amazing form, this amazing portrait, and yet he's got these light sources coming from all over, the color of the light. And I think that's what fascinates me. So the color is not formulaic, it's always looking at and I work in natural light, work in north light, so I'm always looking for the beauty of this light.
Yeah.
And that's part of the magic, you're talking about what the purpose of painting, what the noumenal thing is in painting. Well, I think light has a lot to do with the spiritual heart of painting. Light is very important in painting.
What do you think are some of the strengths and perhaps weaknesses of, let's say, contemporary realistic painting?
Yeah. I'm very glad that painting has come back to realism. I think it's very exciting, back to the figure. But I think the weakness of some of the contemporary realism is that people depend too much on photographs, so they're not able to, they're not free to compose. But I think, more than that, I think any really good figurative painting is first and foremost an abstract design. And I think that's what a lot of contemporary realists don't understand and don't put into their work. And beauty, a lot of the beauty comes from design, just like Sargent, as I was saying. Sargent is always a designer first and foremost. And you could take any painting of his and the design would just knock you out. And the design is often made up of what we call the high readers, or the places of high contrast, the places in a painting that have more visual dominance, and how they interact with each other within the rectangle. And that's what Sargent does, that's what Velázquez does. And I just think that understanding of composition and design is something that a lot of painters don't pay attention to because they're so caught up in the photorealism.
Right.
And photographs can inhibit you because you're not, once you have a photograph of something, it's very hard to move it around to make a composition.
Right. So would you say classical design and elements of it are different from illustration design?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is. Illustration is largely telling a story about objects, and sort of puts the objects in complete this object, this object, this object, whereas I think good figurative painting understands that it's values and shapes that make design, and those values or shapes can interact with forms, part of one form moving into another form. Light can come down and break into a form, and so you have a certain part of that form is in light and hooks up with something else. Figurative painting is more, there are more abstractions going on than illustration.
Right. You've talked about the arabesque and
Yes.
things like that.
Yeah.
Who do you think was best exemplifies some of that?
Well, I think a lot of the Boston school painters do that very well. Paxton and de Camp and sometimes Tarbell, they do that beautifully. And some of those paintings are in the Boston Museum. Well, I think all the great painters do it. I mean, and even if you go back to somebody like Raphael, who isn't necessarily working from life or from, trying to make things look exactly, they're still great designers. And design, I think design in its abstract qualities, that's where it appeals to feeling and emotion. And when you go into a room, across the room you can see immediately whether a painting has something that you want to go up and see more of, or
Right.
if it's just boring and you're not interested. And that usually is the first visual level, which is design.